Welcome, boys and girls. What I'm going to go over with you here, and this is lesson 1.3, the essential question, which is how can you use properties to help you solve problems? Now, there are a few different properties that we're going to take a look at. The first kind of property is called the commutative property. Then there's the associative property, the distributive property, and finally the identity property. Let's take a look at each of these properties and see how they're going to help us solve problems. Alright, so let's first take a look at this commutative property of addition and the commutative property of multiplication. Now, the thing that you need to understand with the commutative property is that the commutative property has to do with the order of the numbers. And what the commutative property says is that if the order of the numbers change, the sum, if it's addition, or the product, if it's multiplication, will be the same. Here's our example. For the commutative property of addition, we have 13 plus 9 plus 7. What that means with the commutative property is we could take these numbers and rearrange them in take these add-ins and rearrange them in any order, and we'll get the same exact answer. Alright, so for example, I have 13 plus 9 plus 7. So if I took 13 plus 9, I would get 22. And if I added the 22 plus the 7, I would get 29. Now, here are the numbers, 13, 9, and 7, added together in a different order. If I take these and add them together in a different order, the commutative property tells me that I'm going to get the same exact answer. So if I took 13 and 7, I would get 20. I would add the 9, and my answer, as you can see, would be the same. So when we're talking of commutative property, we're thinking of in terms of the order, and we should know at this point that the order doesn't matter. The order of the add-ins does not matter. You would get the same exact answer. Same thing would hold true if I took the 7 here and put the 9 here. It would also equal 29. Alright, now let's take a look at the commutative property. The commutative property of multiplication. Now, the commutative property of multiplication is very similar to the commutative property of addition, and what the commutative property of multiplication says is that if you take the numbers and rearrange them in a different order, the product will remain the same. For example, here, I have the numbers 3 times 4 times 2. 3 times 4 times 2 is going to equal the same exact thing as 2 times 4 times 3. It's the same numbers rearranged in a different order. Let me show you here. So if I follow this order, 3 times 4 gives me 12, and I multiply the 2, I would get 24 as my answer. Now the exact same numbers multiplied together in a different order would get me the same answer. If I took the 2 and 4, I multiply, I get 8, I bring down the 3, 8 times 3 also gets me 24. So that is how the commutative property of addition and multiplication work. Now let's take a look at our next property. Okay, now the associative property is a little bit different from the commutative property. The commutative property focused on the ordering of the numbers. The associative property focuses on the grouping of the numbers. Alright, now these numbers are grouped because of the parentheses that are surrounding them. Alright, we know in the order of operations that we need to first solve whatever's in the parentheses here. Now, if we have the associative property of addition, and we were to solve this problem here, we would have to do the 4 plus the 5 first. Okay, now we know 4 plus 5 is going to equal 9, and then we would add on the 3, and we would get 12 as our sum. Now the associative property says, the associative property of addition says, we could take the 3, we could take the 4, and we could take the 5, and we could group them differently, and we could wind up with the same with the same result, with the same answer. Alright, so if I took this 3, this 4, and this 5, and instead of grouping them around the 4 and the 5, if I took them and I grouped, let's say, the 3 and the 4, the associative property tells me I'm going to get the same answer. Alright, let's try it out, see what happens. So now I have the same numbers, but the grouping is different. Order of operations says I need to first solve what's in the parentheses, and we know 3 plus 4 equals 7. After I solve the 3 plus 4 equals 7, I bring down the plus 5, and I'm left with 7 plus 5. And I know 7 plus 5 equals 12. Therefore, this is showing me the associative property of addition. The grouping can be different, and the sum can remain the same. Alright, now the associative property of multiplication works the same way as the associative property of addition. Here you have the 4 and the 5, which are now factors because we're multiplying. The factors 4 and 5 are grouped together, so the order of operations tells us we need to solve what's in the grouped part first, and we know 4 times 5 gets me 20, and I bring down the multiplication sign times the 3, and I know my final answer is 60. Now again, I can take these same numbers and I can group them differently, and my product will remain the same. So I have the 3 times the 4 times the 5. So now let's just say I grouped, instead of the 4 and the 5, let's say I grouped the 3 and the 4. If I grouped the 3 and the 4, the associative property of multiplication tells me I should also get 60 as my answer. So if I took this 3 and this 4, because it's in parentheses, I need to answer that part of it first, and I get 12. I now go to 12 times the 5, and I get my answer of 60. Therefore, 3 times the 4 times the 5 in parentheses equals 3 times 4 in parentheses times 5. And that's how the associative property works. And let's show you how the distributive property works now. Okay, so here's the distributive property, and here's the definition of the distributive property. Distributive property says that multiplying a sum by a number is the same thing as multiplying each add-in by the number and adding them together. Let me show you what that means. Now, here we have the problem 5 times 3 plus 2 in parentheses. Alright, now this distributive property is saying if we take a sum, which is, here we have 3 plus 2, and we multiply it by a number, which is the 5, we're going to get the same thing as if we multiplied this 5 by this 3, this 5 by this 2, and then added them together. Let me show you what I mean here. So we have 3 plus 2, which would be solved first, equals 5. Now we take that sum and we multiply it by a number, which is the 5, and we get as our answer 25. Now, distributive property says that instead of taking the sum and multiplying it by the number, if we take this number and multiply this number by each add-in, that times that times that, and then we combine them, we add them together, we'll get the same answer. Now watch how this works. So I'm going to take this 5 and I'm going to multiply it by this 3. Then I'm going to take this 5 and I'm going to multiply it by this 2. So if I take this 5, multiply it by 3, this 5, multiply it by 2, and then add them together, I should get the same answer. Let's see if it works out. I want to surround my parentheses. Yeah. Okay, well, let's see how it works out. Now, I know my 5 times 3. If I multiplied my 5 times my 3, I would get 15 as my product. I would then multiply my 5 times 2, which I know is 10, and then I combine them, I add them together. 15 plus 10 equals 25. That's how the distributive property works. I'm going to show you another example because I know the distributive property is one that many kids are confused with compared to the other properties. Okay, so here's another example of this distributive property. Alright, and again, the distributive property says we take the sum and multiply it by a number. It's the same thing as taking this number and multiplying it by each of the add-ins and then adding them together. So here's our sum, which would get me the sum of 7, the 4 plus the 3, and then I would take the 4 plus the 3, which was 7, and multiply it by the 2, and I would get my answer, the value of 14. Now, distributive property says, if I take this 2, multiply it by the 4, then take this 2, multiply it by the 3, and then combine them, add them together, I'll get the same answer. So, let's try that. Let's take this 2, okay, and let's multiply it by this 4. Now let's take this 2, and then multiply it by our 3. So, if we take the 2, multiply it by the 4, take the 2, multiply it by the 3, and then add them together, we should get our same answer. So, we have the 2, 4, 2, 3, 2 times 3, I know is 6, 2 times 4 is 8, we then add them together, and it works out, we get our answer of 15. And there's just one more way to look at the distributive property that I'm going to show you. Okay, and here's the final way I'm going to show you how the distributive property can work. We can use the distributive property to find out 8 times 24. Alright, and what we would do to figure out 8 times 24 using the distributive property is we would take this 8 and we would multiply it by the value of each number in each place in the number 24. Alright, so if I had 8 times 24, what I would do is I would rewrite the 8 times 24 as 8 times 20, because the value of the 2 in 24 is 20, and I would take that 8 and I would also multiply it by the value of the other place, which is 4 ones, and then the value is 4. So if you take the 8 times the 20, and then the 8 times the 4, and then add them together, you've now used the distributive property to figure out the first part of the value of this expression. So I have 8 times 20, and then 8 times 4. Alright, I could do in my head by using mental math and figure out that 8 times that 20 is going to get me 160, because 8 times 2 is 16, and I add the 0 on to make it 160. 8 times 4, I know my math facts, equals 32. And from this point here, I can see that the value of that expression is 192 using the distributive property. Again, I took the number and I multiplied it by the value of each position. So 8 times 20, 8 times the 4, and then I add them together to get my value. Okay, now here's our last example that was similar to our first example. Let's take this 5 times 45 and use the distributive property to solve this. So, using the distributive property to solve this, I would take this 5 and I would multiply it by the value of this first position. So I would take the 5 and I multiply it by 4 tens, which equals 40. And then what I would do is I would add that together with the 5 now being multiplied by the 5 ones, which gives me a value of 5. So I would take the 5 times the 40, and I would take the 5 times the 5, and then add them together. I know 5 times 40 is going to give me 200. I would take the 5 times 5, I would get 25. I then add them together, and I have my answer of 225, and that's how I would use the distributive property to find the value of this expression. Right. Those are the properties. That's how they work. Once again, the distributive property seems to be the one that children have the most difficulty with. Rewind this, watch it over again, ask me if you have any questions. Alright, take care. Bye-bye.